Hello everybody, so I'm Maria Alvarez and I'm here chairing the session for the Royal Institute of Philosophy, and it's a great pleasure to introduce Will Kymlicka. Will is a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, a Canadian political philosopher best known for work on multiculturalism and animal ethics. He's currently Professor of Philosophy and Canada Research Chair in Political Philosophy at Queen's University at Kingston. Will has received many honors and awards and is known for several contributions to political philosophy. But among his many books, is particularly relevant to today's talk, his book, Zoopolis, A Political Theory of Animal Rights. And today Will is going to talk about membership rights for animals.
Thank you, Maria. Thanks for that kind introduction. And it's great to be here in London and in Foyles. So this is part of a series of talks about what philosophers can contribute to the pressing issues of the world today. And from my point of view, the animal question is one of those pressing issues. I won't rehearse all the grim facts about our treatment of animals, but just to mention a couple that many of you are probably already familiar with. So in North America, 10 billion land animals are raised and killed every year for food. And if we think about wild animals, their numbers are plummeting. Over the past 40 or 50 years, the average wild animal species has lost 50% of its population. So the way in which we treat animals reflects what Ted Benton calls a quite fantastic species narcissism. I mean, we treat animals as if they exist to serve us, and it's generated this kind of moral catastrophe. So what can philosophy contribute to that issue? If we look over the past 40 or 50 years, I think we see a kind of mixed story. So on the one hand, moral philosophers have, I think, done a really important job in raising critical questions about this sense of human entitlement, this sense of species narcissism. And so in Peter Singer's famous phrase, we should expand the moral circle. We should stop thinking of only humans as being part of the moral circle. We should expand the moral circle to include animals. And that is going to put pressure on our practices of treating animals. And I think those arguments that moral philosophers have made about moral status, the moral circle, have been quite influential, not just in academia, but in the public. They've changed public attitudes and public conversations. And in fact, sociologists who study social movements have argued that the animal rights movement is actually unique in the role that philosophers have played. So sociologists have said that philosophers are the midwives of the animal rights movement, that they really played a central role in the generating of an animal rights movement, and they continue to be kind of iconic figures, well-known, well-read, and well-cited. They play a more influential role in animal rights movement than in any other social justice movement. On the other hand, after 40 or 50 years, I think it's also clear what the limits of that influence has been. So we've changed, many people have changed their ideas about moral status, but that coexists with ongoing political exclusion of animals. Animals have sort of entered into the moral circle, but they continue to be excluded from politics. So no country in the world represents animals in the national legislature. When major decisions are made about laws and public policies, animals' voices are not present, their interests are not considered. So we've got this kind of strange situation of, if you like, moral success and political failure. We've kind of expanded our idea about the moral circle, but animals are not yet in the political circle. And I think that's true not just in kind of the society at large, it's even true in academia and even more specifically in philosophy. So I'm a political philosopher, and what's striking to me is that in my field of political philosophy, the animal question is still basically invisible. So moral philosophers have taken it upon themselves to question this sense of entitlement, but political philosophers continue overwhelmingly, when they write about justice or democracy or legitimacy or power or sovereignty, animals are invisible. I thought this was actually worth testing, so I went together with my co-author Sue Donaldson. We actually did a sample of 30 textbooks in social and political philosophy, and to see are animals present in social and political philosophy. And virtually all of those textbooks said nothing whatsoever about animals. There's no reference to animals whatsoever in these textbooks, except for two which did mention animals, but only to presuppose our right to use them and harm them. So, for example, one of these textbooks said that an important question of global justice is how to fairly allocate rights to fish amongst different countries in international waters. Like, how do we decide whether it's England or France that has the right to fish in certain international waters? But it just took for granted that humans have the right to kill fish for food. So none of these textbooks raised a question about the human entitlement over animals. So as a political philosopher, I find this puzzling and disturbing that political philosophy has been so ineffective in challenging this species narcissism. And so I'm interested in how do we explain this kind of moral, that there's been change on the moral circle front, but ongoing political exclusion, both in the real world and in political philosophy. And I think there's a lot of reasons for this, but one factor that I'm interested in is the role of the idea of society in bridging morality and politics. So I think the idea of society actually plays a kind of intermediary role between morality and politics. So if you ask the average person, what does politics involve? What do we mean by politics, and democratic politics in particular? I think most people would say something like, democratic politics is about how the members of a society govern their society. So our idea of democracy has built into it some idea of a society. And democracy is about how the members of a society govern themselves. And so if we're interested in the inclusion of animals in politics, I think we need to confront the question about whether or under what conditions we can think about animals as being members of society. So not just having moral status, but also having some kind of social status, being part of our social world, such that we can also see them as being part of the demos. So we've got a set of linked ideas here. Moral status, something like social membership, and then something like political membership, the demos. And it's actually kind of an interesting question. What exactly is the relationship between moral status, membership in society, membership in the demos? I think this is where a lot of work needs to be done. I think moral philosophers have given us the arguments we need on moral status, but we still need to do a lot of work to thinking about ideas of social membership and political membership for animals. So I think there's, as I say, a lot of kind of really hard conceptual questions here, but what do we mean by society? What do we mean by membership in society? What's the relationship between social membership and political membership? And that's actually what Sue and I are going to be trying to sort out in our next book. It's going to be trying to dig down into some of these kind of difficult conceptual questions. But for the purposes of this volume and for the purposes of the talk tonight, we were asked to focus on one policy reform that we think might be helpful in improving the world. And so for the purpose of the talk tonight, I'm not going to try to address all of those big conceptual questions. I'm just going to talk about this specific idea that's discussed in the chapter of membership rights for domesticated animals, and even more narrowly, the idea that we should recognize companion animals as members of the family. This is one of my cases, membership in the family, and or as workers in workplaces. And so I'm going to talk about that in a minute, these two specific ideas of family membership and membership in the workplace. But just it's worth noting that in the background, part of the reason I'm interested in these cases is because I think they might help us make this link from morality to society to politics, which is where I think our energy needs to be directed. Okay, so as I say, the volume was asking philosophers to think about specific policy reforms. And in order to know what kind of reforms we should endorse in the animal case, Jessica Eisen has said we should first think about what is the linchpin of what she calls the linchpin. That we should think about what's the linchpin of animal oppression. What kind of underpins this entire structure of oppression of animals? and then think about what kinds of reforms would be effective vis-a-vis this linchpin of animal oppression. So I think it might be useful to think about this idea of a linchpin of animal oppression as operating both at a legal level and a philosophical level. So legally speaking, what makes the oppression of animals possible is that we have an animal law which is based on the idea of humane use. This is the legal doctrine that makes possible the harming of animals. We have a legal doctrine of humane use. So what does that mean? It means humans assert the right to use animals for our benefit. That's the first premise. We have the right to use animals for our benefit, and therefore we designate, for any given animal, we designate what their use is. And we do this legally. So animals might be categorized as agricultural animals or food animals. They might be categorized as zoo animals or as lab animals or as companion animals. So we categorize them according to their use. These are called human use typologies. And then, so that we assert a right to use animals for these designated purposes, but we should avoid harming them more than is necessary to achieve that use. So that's the unnecessary suffering proviso in the law. We have the right to use animals, but we shouldn't impose any unnecessary harm that's not needed to achieve their designated use. So this proviso against unnecessary suffering is sometimes described as animal protection laws. I think that's a misnomer. I don't think there are any such things as animal protection laws in Britain or in Canada. We have animal use laws. The law says we have the right to use animals, but we shouldn't harm them unnecessarily when we use them. That's what the law says. So just to give you a very specific example of how this works, if you think about humane slaughter, so we designate certain animals as food animals, like agricultural animals. We assert the right to kill them, to eat them, but we don't need for them to suffer at the moment of death. So we've passed a law that animals need to be stunned before they're killed. And so with cows and pigs, there are these requirements that they be stunned, and that's what we call humane slaughter. Okay. But now think about fish. We also think of fish as food. There is no way to harvest fish from the ocean humanely. There's no painless way to harvest fish in the ocean. Harvesting fish is excruciatingly painful for the fish. It's the equivalent of humans getting the bends, right? Their lungs explode. So there's no humane slaughter of fish. So why then is it possible? Because there would be no way for us to eat fish if we required that it be done through humane slaughter. But we assert the right to eat fish, and since we can't eat fish without painfully killing them, we painfully kill them, right? So we protect them if and insofar as it's compatible with their use. And since the only way for us to use fish as food is to painfully kill them, we painfully kill them. So that's the structure of existing animal law. Okay, so that's the legal linchpin, this doctrine of humane use that specifies as designated uses and then says we shouldn't impose unnecessary suffering. Underneath that legal doctrine is a philosophical doctrine, which Robert Nozick famously described as Kantianism for humans, utilitarianism for animals. So what that means in this context is when we're thinking about humans, we're Kantians, by which Nozick means we think of humans as having rights that set limits on how much they can be sacrificed for the greater good of others. That's what Kantianism means in this context. So for example, if someone killed me, it might be that they could harvest my organs to save 5 other people. But it's wrong to kill me, even if that would save 5 other people, because I have, as a human being, I have a right not to be sacrificed for the greater good of others. That's what Kantianism means. When it comes to animals, however, we're utilitarians. We don't think that animals have rights not to be sacrificed for the greater good of others. They have interests, they suffer, but if killing 1 pig can save 5 humans, or indeed save 5 pigs, then there's nothing wrong with sacrificing the pig for the greater good of others. So we think of we're utilitarians with respect to animals. We think it's okay to sacrifice them endlessly for the greater good of others in a way that's not acceptable for humans. Okay, so we have a legal linchpin, the doctrine of humane use, and this philosophical doctrine of Kantianism for humans, utilitarianism for animals. And the two of them somehow work together to make possible this vast system of animal oppression. These billions and billions of animals who are being endlessly sacrificed for the benefit of humans because of this conjunction of humane use and Kantianism for humans, utilitarianism for animals. Okay, so that's the problem that we need to address. What's the alternative? How do we attack that status quo? So this is what moral philosophers have been criticizing. And because they're philosophers, they have tended to focus on the philosophical version. They haven't so much focused on the doctrine of humane use, the legal doctrine. They focused on this philosophical doctrine of Kantianism for humans, utilitarianism for animals. And it's actually interesting, I think, that over the past 40 or 50 years, there really almost is now a consensus amongst moral philosophers that that idea, Kantianism for humans, utilitarianism for animals, is not defensible. It's arbitrary, it's unstable, it's speciesist. Not everyone agrees that you can't defend it, but it's surprising. I mean, when people like Peter Singer first criticized that 50 years ago, he was seen as kind of out in left field to challenge that idea. But today, I think most people who work on this issue acknowledge that there's something untenable about Kantianism for humans, utilitarianism for animals. However, moral philosophers disagree about what the alternative is. And so we can think about two obvious alternatives. One is utilitarianism for both humans and animals. So this is Peter Singer's suggestion, is in order to overcome the instability and arbitrariness of the status quo, let's be utilitarians for both humans and animals, which is to say that humans and animals can be sacrificed for the greater good of others. That's just what utilitarianism means. And so concretely, some of you may remember, I guess you're probably all too young, but in 2006, Peter Singer was in a BBC documentary where he was asked whether he thought it was legitimate to engage in lethal experimentation on 100 monkeys if it would generate a cure for 40,000 humans with Parkinson's disease. And he said, yes, that would be legitimate. So we can sacrifice 100 monkeys for the greater good of the 40,000 Parkinson's. So when he said this in the documentary, a lot of people said, what has he changed his mind? I thought he was a defender of animal rights. Now he's defending animal experimentation. But Singer made clear that he always supported the principle that you could sacrifice animals for the greater good of humans. But his point was we should also do that with respect to humans. And so he said he would also support lethal experimentation on 100 humans of what he said comparable cognitive functioning. So we imagine people with severe cognitive disabilities, he would support experimenting on 100 of them in order to save 40,000 people with Parkinson's disease. So that's Singer's image of where we should move towards, utilitarianism for both humans and animals. So in my view, this is a complete non-starter. There's no support whatsoever for the idea that we should start experimenting on people with cognitive disability or any humans in order to generate for the greater good of others. Most people, and I agree, think that the development of this very strong prohibition on experimenting on humans for the greater good of others is one of the great moral achievements of the 20th century, including and indeed especially for people with cognitive disability. So the idea that we would somehow start experimenting on cognitively disabled humans, it's just appalling to most people, and it's not an attractive image about how we might try to address the status quo. So I think the utilitarian strategy is a non-starter. The obvious alternative is then to be Kantians for both humans and animals, and that's, if you like, Tom Regan's approach. His view is we shouldn't be experimenting on the monkeys, we shouldn't be experimenting on humans, because both humans and animals should be seen as having these kind of, if you like, Kantian basic rights not to be sacrificed for the greater good of others. And so just to put my cards on the table, I'm with Regan on this. I actually think the most philosophically defensible account of basic rights would say that all sentient animals should be seen as having certain basic rights not to be sacrificed for the greater good of others. However, politically speaking, I don't think that's realistic in the foreseeable future. The idea that tomorrow we pass a law protecting all sentient animals from being harmed or killed by humans for the sake of humans is just not, again, there's no public support for that. No political party hasn't been in favor of that. It's unrealistic for the foreseeable future. And I think even people who are in favor of that strategy, of the kind of Kantian Rights strategy, know that it's not realistic in the foreseeable future, at least with respect to domesticated animals. So if we look at those cases where people have actually tried to argue for basic rights for animals, they have focused on a handful of cases: primates, elephants, whales. Those are the cases for which we have legal campaigns to recognize basic rights of animals. And I think it's worth noting why those animals? Because they don't actually fit, they don't fall under our ideas about humane use, right? They don't have a designated use. If you ask the average person, what is the designated use of a whale? I mean, 100 years ago, they might have said, well, whaling. We kill whales for oil. But today, virtually no one is likely to say that there's any use for a whale. And so what's the use for what? It's to live freely in the ocean. And so many people are actually okay with the idea that maybe we should indeed respect the basic rights of whales or elephants or primates. The real challenge is whether we can provide any protection for those animals we exploit, that is, those for whom we assert the right to use, right? And even those who defend the Kantian strategy don't recognize that there's no realistic prospect of legally entrenching basic rights for those kinds of animals, particularly for domesticated animals. So I just think, even though I'm very supportive of the Kantian position, basic rights for all sentient animals, I just don't think it's politically realistic in the foreseeable future. But there's another problem with the Kantian strategy, which is that it doesn't actually tell us what we need to know, in a sense. I mean, it tells us certain things we shouldn't do. So we shouldn't experiment on animals. And again, I agree. But it doesn't, but how should we relate to animals? So you can think of this as the kind of morning after question. The morning after we stop experimenting and eating animals, how should we relate to them? How should we relate to pigs after we stop eating them? It's really striking that the Kantians have nothing to say on that question. Nothing. Like Regan is actually quite explicit. He has literally nothing to say about how we should relate to pigs once we stop eating them. And I think that's a problem. I think we need to start thinking about how we're going to relate to animals other than through these use typologies. It's precisely the fact that we have basically we've had centuries, if not millennia, of viewing these animals through these use categories. And so, and we have no other way of thinking about them. So, so we just think pigs just are food animals. We brought them into existence to be food. That's who they are, that's what they're for. And if we don't find some other way of thinking about our possible relations with pigs or cows or chickens or whatever, we're never going to get out of the status quo. So my own view is, rather than endlessly recycling this Kantianism versus utilitarianism debate, which is what moral philosophers have focused on, I think we need a different strategy. We need to shift our focus. So as I say, I think we should start thinking about how should we relate to animals outside of these use typologies. That's what we should be trying to think about. Okay, so that raises the question, how should we relate to animals outside of use typologies? Well, if we ask that question, then I think it's clear that we're going to want to need different relations with different kinds of animals. There's no one model that's going to work for all animals. So to take a simple example, think about dogs and wolves. So as you all know, dogs are domesticated wolves. So in one sense, they're very similar in terms of their basic biology, certainly in terms of their sentience. They're very similar animals. But we surely want to have and should have different relations with wolves than with dogs. With wolves, we basically should leave them alone, right? Including not experimenting on them. But with respect to dogs, they have been bred for literally millennia to live and work alongside us. They've been bred to become dependent on us. So they often need our food and shelter. But they've also been social. Their social lives have evolved and social competences to live and work alongside us. They have evolved to become quite responsive to human voices and human signals and human diet, by the way. And so we surely have certain positive obligations to dogs to care for them, to interact with them, to relate with them, that we don't have with respect to wolves. So how do we explain this variation? So here's my hypothesis, that we should think about domestication as a process of bringing animals into society. That's just what domestication is, literally. Domestication means bringing animals into the domus. The domus means the household. We have brought animals we've taken them out of the wild and bred them over time to live and work alongside us. And as a result of that, we have made them members of our society. We did that. We brought them into our society. We now need to acknowledge that they're members of society. It's their society as much as ours. And they should be recognized as members. Or to put it another way, we should extend an ethic of membership to them. Now, if that's right, in my view, it has profound consequences, because I think the idea of an ethic of membership is actually the structural basis for contemporary politics. So I think contemporary welfare states, contemporary democracies operate according to an ethic of membership. So some of you may know, just set aside animals for the moment, if you think about T.H. Marshall's account about the British welfare state after the Second World War, he was trying to explain what is the logic of a national welfare state in Britain. And he said, it rests on the idea of social membership. And what does that mean? First of all, we think of ourselves as forming a society. That's the first thing. We think of ourselves as forming a society together. We think of this society as being a common possession of its members. This is Marshall's phrase. We think of this society as being a common possession of all of its members. And that entails two key membership rights. The first is the right to share in the benefits of social life, the benefits of social cooperation. And so this is what I think underpins something like public health care, right? Because we are members of society, which is a common possession, we have a right to share in the social product, e.g. through public health insurance. It also entails the political right to shape the norms that govern social cooperation. So it generates a democratic claim that if you are a part of this scheme of social cooperation, you should have the right to shape the norms of social cooperation. Okay, so for Marshall, the welfare state and democracy rest on an ethic of membership. And my view is we now need to extend that to domesticated animals. It's their society too, and therefore we should think of society as being it's also their common possession. It belongs to them as much as to us, and therefore they have positive rights to share in the social product. So, and this is different from wolves. Wolves, on a Kantian view, have the right not to be experimented on, not to be killed, captured, held captive, and so on. But members who are participants in the scheme of social cooperation also have positive rights to share in the product of social cooperation. And so I think that justice for domesticated, so basically I think of justice for domesticated animals as operating at two levels. With the Kantians, I think that all sentient animals have certain basic negative rights, not to be experimented on, not to be killed. But domesticated animals also have membership rights. We've brought them into our society, we owe them membership, and that includes the right to share in, positive rights to share in the social product and to shape the social norms. Okay, so that's my image of justice for domesticated animals that really puts a lot of weight on this idea of social membership. That's very abstract. So in the book, we were encouraged to think about some concrete examples. And so I was looking around to see, can we see any kind of real-world examples of this ethic of membership in relation to domesticated animals. And I think we can see two, if you like, just kind of seeds of this ethic of membership emerging. One is in relation to the family. So companion animals are increasingly being seen, I think, by citizens and by the law as members of the family. So the default until very recently is that companion animals are property, the property of a family. Someone in the family owns the dog or the cat. That's the default. But if companion animals are just property, then think about what happens in the case of a divorce. The dog or cat will go to whoever has the best property claim. So for example, whoever has a credit card receipt showing that they bought the dog has the property claim to the dog. Most people don't think of their companion animals as just property. They think of them as members of the family. We know this from public opinion polls. They really think of them as members of the family. And that therefore they think that in cases of a marriage breakdown, the dog or the cat should go with whomever will look after the dog or cat the best. It should be based on custody should be based on the best interests of the dog or the cat. Just as custody of so children are not property. Custody over children should be based on the best interests of the child. Most people think the same principles should apply to dogs or cats. Custody should be based on the best interests of the animal, not property, right? And so what we see is some judges, in common law cases, some judges just declaring that they are going to treat companion animals as members rather than property. But we also see in some jurisdictions, legislatures are passing laws to recognize companion animals as members, literally, in law, to designate them as members of the family, not as property of the family. Okay, so that's one example of how we see an idea of membership creeping into the law. The second example I look at is in relation to workers, animals who engage in work. So think about sniffer dogs at an airport, or police dogs, military dogs, or animals involved in therapy. These could be therapy dogs or horse. There's a lot of equine therapy. So at the moment, again, the default is animals are property of the business, right? So the human therapist owns an animal. The police own a dog. The military owns a horse. They're property, they're equipment. And this is the way actually they are listed. Like if you look at, it's not uncommon, it certainly was the case, that for example, the US Army listed dogs and horses under equipment. That's the property of the Army. And when they were no longer functioning, when they were no longer to do their job as equipment, they were just killed. And so police forces, military, and humans who were therapists just killed the equipment when the equipment was no longer able to do the job, right? But many people, including those who work most closely with these animals, don't actually think of them as property. They've come to think of them as colleagues. You see a lot of discussion about this, for example, about with the military dogs. The human handlers of the military dogs think of them as working together. They're colleagues who have each other's back. And they develop quite strong bonds, and who are therefore very upset by the fact that the Army used to view them as just property. And so they have mobilized to gain legal change in the status of working animals, such that they are recognized as workers, as personnel. So in the US Army today, military dogs are personnel. They're not property, they're not equipment, they're personnel. And as personnel, they have a right to retirement. A right to repatriation if they've been overseas, and then a right to retirement rather than being killed when they can no longer do their job. Okay, so that's recognition of animals as members of a workplace rather than as property. Okay, so these are two examples that I just think are interesting as just kind of preliminary seeds of a membership ethos in our relations with domesticated animals. I'm interested in how far we can push this logic of an ethic of membership. And I just want to flag to notice how different this strategy is from Singer's expanding the moral circle metaphor. I mean, these are just different images, and they're not necessarily incompatible. But when Singer's talking about expanding the moral circle, his vision is there are these moral circles. There's the innermost moral circle, which is the family, then the ethnic group, the nation, humanity at large, and then the outermost circle is animals. And we need to recognize that these outermost, these most distant, foreign, alien animals are nonetheless moral beings. Whereas the membership strategy says animals, they aren't out there at the outer edge. They're right here with us in the most intimate, innermost circle, like in the family. What for Singer is the innermost circle, the reality is for many people, their families are interspecies families, right? They view animals as members of the family. And I think this is a membership strategy, rather than locating animals at the outer periphery of morality, instead thinks about how we are members of interspecies families, workplaces, neighborhoods, so on. Okay, so this is what as I say, I'm interested in this idea of a kind of membership ethic and where it's bubbling up in the law. Having said that, it's probably very clear how limited these two seedlings are with respect to an ethic of membership. These are just very preliminary, fragmentary recognitions of an ethic of membership. And let me just mention two obvious limits in terms of these existing examples. One is that at the moment, both recognition of companion animals as family members and working animals as workers are, if you like, they're micro memberships in the private family, membership in a private workplace, whereas the ethic of membership that I described earlier, T.H. Marshall's idea, says that society as a whole belongs to all of its members. So the full-blooded ethic of membership would say that dogs and cats aren't just members of the family, they're members of society. And that has implications, for example, public health care, right? It's not just that they should be looked after by their family, they should be looked after by society. They have claims on all of us as members of society. So we need to, and so similarly, thinking about animals as workers means they don't just have claims on their colleagues or on their employer, but also on the economy as a whole. And on the polity as a whole. So we need to, if this is to be really transformative and progressive, we need to expand this ethic of membership from being just about micro units to being able to make membership claims on society as a whole. Public institutions, public resources, public goods, public spaces, so on. I'm actually relatively optimistic about that issue. I think as soon as we start thinking about animals as members of the family, people are going to press public institutions to take care of their family members. And I think we can see evidence of that. The second limit, however, is a bit more serious, which is that to date at least, both of these, family membership and worker recognition of animals as workers, only apply to a very small number of domesticated animals. Dogs, cats in the case of companion animals, basically dogs and horses in the case of working animals. Neither has been applied to farmed animals, right? So farmed animals are not recognized as members of the family. They're not recognized as workers. And they're the ones who need our help most, right? They're the ones who are most oppressed. So if this strategy is only going to end up helping dogs and cats and horses, then it's not really, I still think we should be helping dogs and cats and horses, but that's, if we want to address the linchpin, we need to ask whether this membership strategy can somehow help those domesticated animals who are most oppressed. And so can we imagine a scenario under which farmed animals can come to be seen as either members of the family or as workers? And I think it's hard. I can imagine some scenarios, but it's not obvious. So just here's one scenario. There is an interesting trend, I know more about the North American case than in Britain, but towards the development of farmed animal sanctuaries in which people rescue farmed animals from factory farms and try to develop new relations with farmed animals. And some of these sanctuaries are actually called micro sanctuaries. They're actually on a quite small scale and in kind of suburban settings. And many of them are, in a way, and this is how people describe them, welcoming farmed animals as members of the family. don't know if some of you have heard about Esther the Wonder Pig in Toronto. This is a Canadian case. But I mean, we have many such stories about how people have rescued farmed animals and have come to develop kind of companionable relationships with goats, with pigs, certainly with chickens. And we know that all of these domesticated animals are capable of having companionable relations with us. They couldn't have been domesticated if they weren't capable of having sociable relations with us. And so I think we could imagine a scenario under which the idea that only dogs and cats have companion relationships with us starts to break down, and that we start to see that there isn't this sharp divide between companion animals and farmed animals, that all domesticated animals are capable of having sociable relations with us. So that's. I mean, I don't want to put too much weight on that. That's just a small trend, and it's not clear how far it'll go. But it would be interesting to think about how we could push this membership idea so that it doesn't just apply to a handful of dogs and cats and horses, but applies more generally to all domesticated animals. Okay, so just to sum up, I think that there's a lot of hard work. I don't want to pretend as if this is a magic solution to anything, and I think it's unclear, actually, how transformative or progressive this strategy can be. So I see there's kind of two fronts for work that we need to do. One, on the kind of policy law front, is to think about what are other ways we might try to legally instantiate this kind of ethic of membership. How can we push it forward, both in terms of the micro units within which animals can be seen as members and in terms of their claims on the larger society. And then the second is a philosophical task, which is to rethink. I think we really do need to rethink from the ground up. What do we mean by society? We've got kind of 2,000 years of philosophy telling us that society is a human exclusive phenomenon, when in fact we live in interspecies societies, interspecies families, interspecies workplaces, interspecies neighborhoods, but we don't have good philosophical language for describing that. So I think we know this is a task for social and political philosophy, is to rethink our categories in a more interspecies context. Okay, thanks.
Thanks very much, Will. That was really fascinating, immensely thought-provoking. At least I have lots of questions, but I'm sure maybe other people have also, so I'm going to maybe give the opportunity for people to think about that. Maybe I'm going to start with not a specific question, but a very general question to you, which was provoked by reading about the title, the Philosophical Manifesto. Because what you're suggesting seems to me so ambitious in many dimensions, both theoretical and practical. I wanted to ask you if you could choose what achievement your work in this area could bring, as a sort of what you could make happen. Would it be a change in the way in which we think about this issue? And if so, what change would it be? Or would it be a specific, say, legal change? Or
yeah. So it's the former. Okay. I think one of the real problems animal advocacy has faced is that for 40 years or longer, we have really powerful, clear, powerful, persuasive, convincing explanations of what's wrong with the way we treat animals. But we have not had clear, convincing, inspiring images of what justice, of what the alternative, what is it we want to replace this with, and this is particularly in the case of wild animals. We might think we just leave them alone. I mean, we could talk about that, but it's a bit too simple to say just leave them alone. But to some extent, as a first cut, that's not a bad answer. Within many cases, with many wild animals, what we should be aiming for is just leaving them alone. But that's just not, it's not a possible answer, it's not a defensible answer in relation to domesticated animals. we have bred them to be dependent on us, and so it would be morally unacceptable to just say, okay, I'm done with you, domesticated animals. I'm going to stop giving you shelter. I'm going to stop giving you food. I'm not going to have any relationship with you. I'm just going to leave you alone, and you sink or swim. That would be totally unacceptable. So we need some positive image of how we're going to interact with domesticated animals outside of use. And many of my animal rights colleagues, so as I say, Regan just says, I have no idea. He just shrugs his shoulders, I have no idea. Others do have an idea, which is that there is no possibility of just relations with domesticated animals. We'll never have just relations with domesticated animals. They're too weak, they're too vulnerable, they're too dependent. Our incentives for using them are too strong. So the only route forward is extinction. I don't know how many of you are aware of this. In the animal rights movement, this is a strong strand. Our goal should be the extinction of domesticated animals. This is sometimes called the one generation and out strategy. We look after existing domesticated animals, prevent them from reproducing, and then one generation from now, there are no domesticated animals in the world, just humans and wild animals. So I think this, I mean, I could go on and on, but what I think this is just, it's not a morally acceptable position, and it shows a complete poverty of imagination, but it's a challenge. I understand why people are tempted towards that extinctionist framework, because we don't have an alternative image of what just relations with domesticated animals can look like. So I think this is, before we get to legal reforms, we need to think seriously, is there such a thing? Can there be just relations with domesticated animals? Or that, to my mind, that's the first question in relation to domesticated animals. Are we going to be extinctionists? Are we in favor of this kind of one generation and out strategy? We're going to stop them from reproducing and there just won't be domesticated animals 20 years from now? Or do we think that we have an obligation to create just relations with domesticated animals? And if we take that second strand, which is what Sue and I are trying to do in our work, that requires an exercise of imagination, of creativity. We need to think about what are the sites in which we can experiment with new kinds of relationships. We also need new concepts. I mean, so I'm hoping that the idea of membership can help us think through some of this. But so I actually think there is a kind of big intellectual, conceptual problem of imagination that we need to address, and no single legal reform in of itself is actually going to deal with that.
Thank you. Let me open the field to the. Any questions, or please?
So I just want to push this extinctionist thought a bit, because when you were describing the family membership and membership in the workplace, you kind of described that in quite optimistic terms as bringing animals into those private domains. But you might think, actually, it's just an extension of what you kind of gestured at the beginning, which is that it's human designated purpose. We want them to be our companions. We want them to labour for us. And so, should we really be that optimistic about membership, right? Isn't it just a restatement or kind of just giving them a different kind of purpose?
Yeah, great. So, I completely accept that is the challenge. In the paper, there's actually a long section about exactly how would we know the difference between this being just another version of humane use. We want to use animals for companionship. We want to use them for labor, but we should do so humanely. What's the difference between a humane use of companion animals and working animals and a membership model? That's the challenge. So this is partly why I want to embed these legal reforms in this broader idea of an ethic of membership. I think it's absolutely right that these existing reforms in and of themselves are ambiguous. They could just be versions of humane use. And in fact, in the longer version, I try to discuss. So there are actually. I don't want to get into too much details, but I discuss 4 different ways in which animals are companion animals being recognized as members of the family in the law. One of them is about custody, one of them is about liability, one of them is about trust, inheritance. I won't go into all the details, but the short answer is some of them just are humane use. It's just completely clear. It's the interests of the owners who want more security with respect to their use of their companion animal, and it just so happens that it's in the interests of the owners to have them recognized as members because it gives them more security vis-a-vis third parties and so on. But there are other dimensions of the recognition of companion animals as members of the family, which I think are more plausibly understood as reflecting a genuinely different ethic, an ethic not of humane use, but of co-membership, which, but if for that to be true and to be stable, I think it needs to be connected to this broader Marshallian idea of society as a common possession of its members. And so this is why I'm really interested in the question whether recognizing companion animals as members of the family is or is not going to lead to the idea that they're members of society generally, who as such have a positive right to share in the benefits of social cooperation. And so, I mean, I think companion animals should be covered by public health insurance. That to me just is that's. I mean, I'm just an old-fashioned social democrat with respect to my views of what that's what the welfare state should do, and the welfare state is based on membership rights, and I think domesticated animals should have membership rights. So but in the paper, what I try to mention, I try to kind of trace what would be the path by which the recognition of companion animals as members of the family is going to generate this more robust claim of membership in society generally, and going to generate this idea of society as a common possession, that it belongs to them as much as to us. And there's many steps, and so I sort of optimistically suggest in the paper that we've taken more than one step. We can see some evidence that this membership idea is actually expanding, so that it's not just making claims on the micro unit of the family, but also making broader claims on the society as a whole.
Thank you. Question over there, very good.
I was really interested in what you said about the ethic of membership and the fact that it has these kind of 2 different rights. And as far as I can tell, you've definitely talked a lot about this right to share in the social product in terms of like public health or workers' rights and family rights. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your ideas for how domesticated animals might have this right to shape the norms that govern social cooperation, because of course, just in a very obvious terms, I can think of, maybe some initial objections or confusions, like the kind of communication barriers that we have, or whether voting is possible. And I'm sure that there are ways of, getting around that. But I'd be interested to hear what you think.
Right. So this is an area of intense debate in the field these days. So the diagnosis I started with, like the moral philosophers have done their job of giving us arguments about moral status, and now it's the time for social and political philosophers to do our bit. I'm definitely not the only person who's there are several of us, including other people in this room, who are part of this project. And who are interested in how do we, whose focus is no longer only on the question of how do we think about moral status, but how do we think about political inclusion, and political voice, and political agency, and political communication, political representation. So there's a whole nest of issues here that many of us are. It's a relatively new field, kind of at most 10 years. Or even less, but this is, to my mind, it's one of the most exciting areas, is how to think about what does it mean to actually give animals a say, a voice in shaping the social norms of society. So to oversimplify, there's kind of two schools of thought in the literature. One is animals should be seen as basically passive. The animals cannot speak for themselves. They cannot represent themselves. So political representation can only take the form of human trustees, human proxies, speaking for animals. The alternative view is that that animals are capable of engaging in political communication with us. They're actually doing that all the time. They're telling us what kind of a world they want to live in. And we just need to learn how to listen to what they're telling us about the kind of world they want to live in. And so then the question is, what would be the sites where we might be able to see animals telling us? So the premise of this second view is animals are in fact telling us what kind of world they want to live in. But most of us are completely incapable, or we are either unwilling or unable at the moment to understand what they're saying. But we can learn how to understand what they're telling us about what kind of world they want to live in, and that requires us to, on the one hand, create spaces, create new, literally physical spaces in which animals are able to explore different possible ways of relating to us. We need to basically create space for animals to experiment with different ways of relating to us. And then we can see what kinds of choices they make. So, like, for example, what kinds of work do they enjoy engaging in? What kinds of physical environments do they like to spend time? What kind of social relationships? Do they like hanging out only with members of their own species, or do they like hanging out with members of different species? That there's a whole set of questions about the social world they want to live in, the physical environment they want to live in, the kinds of activities they want to engage in, that we could rethink politics. We could think about the political task. So it's not going to be through voting. It's not that we're going to give animals the vote. It's rather that we're going to create choice situations which are, if you like, the equivalent of voting. So that animals would be, in effect, voting by us having created the context in which they're different possibility. They're exposed to different possibilities, and then we can see which ones they express enthusiasm for. I mean, so obviously this is not simple, and there's a whole lot of objections to this way of thinking about it. But just for what it's worth, this is a view that Sue and I are working with in our own work. That obviously at some points in the process we need humans to speak on behalf of animals. So there will be a role for trustees and proxies at various times and places in the political process. But it's equally, on our view, it's equally important to ask animals themselves. There need to be moments where we're asking animals themselves, what do they want? And that requires thinking about what are the spaces and places where animals can be exposed to different ways of living with us, and can thereby express what kind of world they want to live in. I don't know if that helps.
Definitely.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit how you think we should think about an issue the issue of membership, and you mentioned the possibilities of the welfare state, as it were, extending because animals belong, we give them this membership. But of course, today there is issues of membership among human communities which are very pressing. I mean, in terms of refugees, immigration, and so on. And it occurred to me a very vivid example, not of exactly that point, but in the evacuation from Afghanistan, there was a big sort of controversy because this group of animals were evacuated before a number of. So how should we, in your view, think about, as it were, the competition of membership and resources in relation to animals vis-a-vis humans who don't belong to our community yet?
Yeah. There are really two separate questions here. One is, who is, as a matter of kind of sociological fact, who is in fact a member of society? And we can ask that both with respect to animals and with respect to humans. So let me back up. You know, one of the complaints about Germany's citizenship law until quite recently is it was very difficult for the Turkish immigrants, the guest workers, to become citizens. And so they may have been living there for 20 years, 30 years, their children may have been born there, but neither the first generation immigrants nor the children who were born there could become citizens because they didn't have the right blood. So political philosophers virtually everyone who I know who political philosophers reject that and argue that if a Turkish person of Turkish origin has made a life for themselves in Germany, they are members of society. They may not be legally recognized as a member, but they should be recognized as members. If you've made a life for yourself in the country, if you've put down roots, then you have a right to be treated as a member. So in Joe Karen's formulation, political citizenship should track the fact of social membership. The Turkish residents of Germany had been there long enough that they should be seen as social members and therefore should have access to political citizenship. I think the same argument applies to domesticated animals. They've made a life here. This is their home. They are social members. They should be treated as social members. So that's one question. Are we recognizing all of those who are in fact members of society? And we probably fail, we'd certainly fail with respect to domesticated animals, but we'd probably fail with respect to some humans. There are some humans, like for example, people who may have entered the country illegally are often, in my view, even if they entered illegally, if they've been here long enough, they should be seen as social members. At some point, it doesn't matter how you first came to be here. This is now your home. You should be recognized as a social member. Okay, so there's a set of issues about the extent to which our existing legal recognition of membership actually tracks who is in fact a member. That's one question, and I think the arguments that political philosophers have developed about why we should extend membership to long-term immigrants apply equally to domesticated animals. Okay, the second question is, under what conditions is it permissible for a society and its members to keep other people out? And in particular, those who are from either much poorer countries, or whether they're climate refugees or they're fleeing persecution. So that's the issue about admissions. And political philosophers, actually, there's a deep disagreement about under what conditions it's legitimate, particularly for members of rich Western countries, to be closing the door to those who want to become members. So they haven't made a life here, but they want to make a life here. And are we allowed to keep them out? Who can we keep out? Under what conditions, and so on? I don't. I think these are two genuinely different questions, and if it's a fact, and it probably is, that we should be more open with respect to admitting people who might want to enter, does not give us any justification for not acknowledging the membership of those who are here. I just think that there really is necessity. There is a kind of imperative on, at least on, as the way I think about it, that there is a kind of overwhelming imperative of justice to acknowledge the membership of those who are in fact members of society.
But can I press you?
Yeah.
Because you're right, that there were many threads in that question. But what I was thinking is that sometimes the justification for keeping people out is we don't have enough resources for, we can barely cover the needs of the people who are already in. And I suppose sometimes people might think, and we certainly don't have enough resources to do the kind of welfare caring that you were talking about in relation to, say, farm animals that we cease to use but treat as in the ways that you were suggesting. And some people may think, well, that's a difficult decision.
Yeah, okay, but so just, one kind of technical point. Why are there 10 billion land animals in North America? It's because we force them to reproduce, right? So we breed them to reproduce at a much higher rate than is their natural reproduction, right? Because that's what's economically efficient. So in a world in which we stopped viewing pigs and cows and chickens as food, there would be far, far fewer of them because we would no longer be massively, forcibly forcing them to reproduce. So even if we allowed, and this is an interesting, complicated question, to what extent domesticated animals should be seen as having a right to reproduce of their own volition. But absolutely, they have the right not to be forced to reproduce, and therefore there would be a dramatic decline in the numbers. So it wouldn't be as kind of overwhelming as one might think. When 10 billion, there wouldn't be anywhere near that number in my vision of the future. But I still. So here's the way I think about it. There's domestic justice and there's global justice. Depending on your theory about global justice, you might think that rich countries have strong obligations to share, to either send resources to poor countries or to open their borders so that people from poor countries can come. I want to be, at least for this talk, agnostic. I'm prepared to accept strong. I'm not entirely clear what my own views on that question, but I'm certainly open to the possibility that we have very strong obligations of global justice. I don't want to resist. Nothing in my argument requires denying that we might have very strong obligations of global justice. We as a society might have very strong obligations to send resources, to share resources, or to admit others. My argument is that this when I talk about our society, that our society must include the domesticated animals, and that therefore, so let's imagine. This is probably not a helpful way of thinking about it, but let's imagine that our theory of global justice says that rather than spending 1% or 2% on foreign aid, let's say we should spend 10% of our GNP on foreign aid, 20%. You pick the number. I'll let you pick the number. My claim is whatever is left, if it's let's say we should give away 20% of our resources, whatever is left, that 80%, is the common possession of the humans and domesticated animals. And so, you know, your theory of global justice will tell me how much we should share our resources with people outside the country. But my claim is whatever is left, whatever is rightfully ours as a society, rightfully belongs to all of its members, including the domesticated animals. And so that could be, that pool of what it, so that it's a, society is a common possession of its members, that whatever rightfully belongs to us belongs to all of us, humans and domesticated animals alike. And that could be much less than we currently claim, because maybe we should be giving much more of it to people outside the country. But I just think it's, I don't think that the claim of global justice can be invoked to deny that whatever rightfully belongs to us belongs to all of us. That's the way I think about it.
Thank you. That's very helpful. So we're running out of time. I don't know if there are any last questions. Okay, here we have time for just one last question.
For you, would membership of animals not entail some Kantian rights? Because for humans, we, as you said, we usually ascribe those Kantian rights, whereas it was utilitarianism for animals. So your ethic of membership would not ascribe those Kantian rights to animals?
No, so my view is, I'm not sure if I got the question, but the Kantian rights are independent of membership. So it's not, which is to say, I'm actually with Regan on that, well, not exactly, but close enough, that basically my view is that sentient animals who have an experience of their own lives, who experience their lives going well or badly, and so those animals who are sentient in the sense of having a subjective experience of their lives going better or worse, should be seen as having Kantian rights, not to be sacrificed for the greater good of others. It shouldn't be experimented on, shouldn't be caged and confined and so on. But that has nothing to do with their membership. That's as true about the wolf as about the dog. It's as true about the fish in the ocean as about dogs and cats. So the Kantian rights flow from, if you like, the kind of intrinsic moral status of a being with subjectivity, with sentience. So you don't have to prove you're a member. There's no membership requirement for the Kantian negative rights. There is a kind of sentience requirement, but there's no membership requirement. The membership requirement is only with respect to claims on society. And so, you know, in my view, many wild animals have no need for or interest in making claims on the social product. They really just want to be left alone, and they don't want to be seen as they don't want to be recruited into our schemes of social cooperation. They want to live independently of our schemes of social cooperation. But for those domesticated animals whom we've brought into our schemes of social cooperation, they have membership rights. Those are rights specifically targeted at the product of that social cooperation and the rules of that social cooperation. I don't know if that helps answer the question.
Well, thank you very much. I think we can thank Will for this really thought-provoking and incredibly ambitious vision of how we should be thinking about this. Thank you very much.
Thank you.